What I Needed to Learn at the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Symposium and Festival, written by Taylor Reed. In late May, I traveled north to represent Crosshatch at the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Symposium and Festival, held in Marquette, Michigan. Here's the anatomy. Indigenous, referring to the original inhabitants of this land, largely Anishinaabe, but representatives from all over the country were present. I'd venture to guess around 90% of participants were Native American. Food sovereignty, referring to involvement and ownership in the systems of food and nutrition, foundational to health and well-being. Think seed saving, hunting, foraging, processing, preserving, regenerative agriculture, and cooking. Symposium. Academic talks were held at Northern Michigan University. A couple examples. Land tenure equity and security as a prerequisite to resilient indigenous food systems, and Overview of the Great Lakes Indigenous Materials Poop Study, or GLIMPS. Festival. Fireside chats, workshops, and meals were all shared out of doors at a campground down the road from the university. A few examples. Cooking with clay pots, making and using botagan, and black ash basket making. The 3-day gathering left my head spinning. I actually left around lunch on the final day because I could feel myself edging towards the line separating being provoked to thought and being plain overwhelmed. I packed my things into the car and took Highway 28 east towards the bridge, mile markers passing, thoughts methodically being filed into place. Then it hit me. About an hour north of home, I drove past a man bumping along his lawn on a riding mower. The late May vision was absolutely unremarkable. Nothing to it. Yet, everything to it. Totally novel. I felt as if I was setting eyes upon a different country. Apparently, the weekend had affected my senses, and upon returning, I was jarred by a most ordinary sight. Why? I wish I could tell you. It might have had something to do with the fact that I had been sleeping in a tent at night and had been keeping tabs on how much drinking water I had, and had been privy to conversations centering upon story, land, dependence, respect, and trauma, and had been concentrating quite a bit on which words I used when I felt I had something worth saying. For some reason, that felt like a far cry from a world of riding mowers, domestic beers, and evening television. Why? I wish I could tell you. Soon after, though, it faded. I lost track of notes that I had taken, and memory started to dissipate. Keeping in touch with the contacts I had made felt less urgent. And I realized now, 6 months later, I never reached out to some. 2 spoons sit on my desk. They were whittled from the trunk of an apple tree here that had been upended by a tornado as I was away. They're still waiting to be sent to friends met that weekend. What I thought had shaped me, for a quick minute, was no longer front of mind, and the whole thing started to disappear. Just this morning, I was reminded of one of the more profound teachings from those days in Marquette. It wasn't totally novel. It was one of those things that I've always felt deep down, but never clearly expressed, articulated, or fully grappled with. It has to do with access to information. A number of conversations and questions brought up during sessions that weekend had to do with access and relationship, especially between Native American and non-Indigenous populations. I remember a friend sharing how uncomfortable he was when he realized that his was the only hand raised aloft at the question of, who in this room owns land? Participants debated over whether Western institutions and technicians should have access to cherished seeds, viewed as ancestors, painstakingly passed along. Should their technical expertise and methodology be prioritized to coax aged seeds towards life? Is overlooking instances of seed lineages that haven't been fully returned to their community caretakers unwise? Short-term employees questioned how they could best fulfill their tasks of initiating relationships and creating inroads with their assigned tribal communities when they knew their interactions were limited to 6 months. Most of these talks eventually honed in on a single idea. Words on their own are not that valuable. They have to be connected to things more concrete: time, energy, shared work, and presence. These pieces anchor and animate words and intentions, lending them authenticity and leading towards mutual respect and understanding. Kevin Finney took this a step further. He had been sitting around a fire, relaying stories on canoes and canoe making. His presentation, with assistance from Caitlin Grenier and Zach Early, was entitled Anishinaabe Himanan: The Roles and Spiritual Connections of Traditional Watercraft to Our Food Systems and Seasonal Foodways. I sat on the ground, just outside the initial ring of folding chairs. He touched on properly harvesting materials from the forests. He spoke about requiring that canoes be used, rather than displayed, ideally by younger generations badly needing to experience what's involved in the region's traditional practices. He talked about appropriate technology developed over long periods of time, and the physics of how dugout canoes have such a remarkably level and consistent thickness. It has to do with campfires in canoes while out on the water. He described a stretched hide canoe under moonlight, gliding above the water, with moonlight reflecting up through the translucent craft's skin. And he talked about repairs, how the vessels facilitating travel, food, and trade could be restructured in an afternoon from forest materials Anishinaabe have had relationship with for millennia. At the end of the canoe's useful life, its materials can be restored to natural ecological cycles within mere seasons. And he also shared that he's often asked to make more YouTube videos on the content. That's what brought about the teaching that's been in the back of my head for the past 6 months. Sitting around that circle was spellbinding. I understand why people would ask him to record his words for convenient access anywhere and anytime. Yet, his response to that frequent request is no. A firm no. He's not going to make more videos for YouTube. Not all information is for all people at all times, and the proliferation of information available today is dangerous. He spoke of an Indigenous model of stewarding information, largely in-person, oral, rooted in place, and rooted in practices of livelihood that yield to the natural world while addressing big questions, both chronologically big and existentially big. Then he spoke of a Western model where disembodied information is celebrated, and generally the thought is that more access to more information equals a better outcome. My wife works at a library. My parents teach at public schools. These are each bastions of the Western model of information availability. I love libraries. I understand the value of schooling. But Kevin is right. The Indigenous perspective that he's sharing from relays that knowledge is information paired with responsibility, with obligation, with relationship. Knowledge is information with purpose and context. And many of our methods of sharing information today are devoid of these accompanying frameworks. Here's an example coming far from that day around the campfire. When I was trying to work towards better video and editing work for Crosshatch, I'd watch tutorials on the internet. I'd find a channel that spoke to what I was trying to figure out, and I'd work to model that approach myself. They'd share tips on camera settings and techniques, and I'd dial in the equipment that I had and would follow their lead. And then I'd find a different channel sharing about editing, for instance, and I'd do the same. After a while, though, things clashed. My settings were causing glitches, keyboard shortcuts were overriding other things that I was trying to do, and a lot of time was going into piecing together just what was making things run amok. I later realized Each of those channels shared information specific to a single way of doing things, optimized for a specific intention, usually in a specific style, in a specific time and place. By taking cues from one channel and others from another, I was creating a hybridized system that had no commitment to where I was, when I was, what I was using, and what I was trying to do. It was a mess. From there, I resolved to simply spend time doing the work with the camera and spend time doing the editing and figure out from there how settings, technique, equipment, and software would work together best with consideration to my own circumstances. I'm limited by how much I can learn in each outing, but it feels like a saner pace, and I'm developing the muscle memory and physical sensations of actually doing the work reflectively over time and embedded in place. Nobody has longer traditions of doing the work reflectively, over time, and embedded in place than the Indigenous. And here this teacher was, sharing that the best of learning is through relationship and doing, and that we have a lot to learn when it comes to figuring out how to live best. We have a lot to learn about resilient communities and culture. We have a lot to learn about food systems we can depend upon. We have a lot to learn about how to treat the land we live from with dignity and respect. And if we really want to learn more about these from him, well, we'll have to travel to West Michigan and live and work in the woods with him. That's the best way. That raises a challenge for me. My goal is to share needed information well, but my work at its worst might look like peddling useless information. If you've read this far, first, thank you. Second, you're the type I need to keep me accountable. I want to be quiet when I should, and share knowledge when that knowledge is appropriate. And most of all, I don't want to forget what's important and needed. And what does that take? Time, energy, shared work, and presence. Without the proper relationship between facts and what matters, between theory and practice, between understanding and place, our words and teachings can be noise, distraction from what's needed. We need the wisdom to discern and carefully reconsider some of what's normalized in our society. The barrage of information, the barrage of marketing, the barrage of manipulation. Might we be grounded in what is real? I had an idea of what the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Symposium and Festival meant. There was more to it. I'm not there anymore, but I still hold on to something. I still hold on to something.